special presentation tonight on the community survey that's been developed.
We're going to start with Indian Point, then we'll get into the survey. As Lisa and Barbara mentioned, I've been on tour talking to PTAs about all things Indian Point. And so some of these slides are redundant. Some of these slides the board has seen in a different format, but wanted to put this conversation on record for the public, since they've seen me remotely. I start my presentation talking about this infograph. We started using this sort of communication tool a number of years ago to highlight return on investment in our district. And the goal of this infograph was really born out of communicating with parents who are non-residents. Because we have a majority of our residents are not parents, and they pay school taxes as well. And so we wanted to use this as a communication tool so they could see that while they may not have kids or nieces or nephews or grandkids in our district, the return on their investment is very positive with a lot of these outcomes. And these aren't just test scores, but these are opportunities as well. You see 95% of our elementary students, 4th and 5th graders, take an instrument. Our average tax increase, 0.5 point since 2011. Average class size in the elementary of 19 students. These are data points that a lot of schools, a lot of school districts in our county would have a really difficult time meeting. What we know, though, is because of the planned closure of Indian Point, those successes may be at risk. And what we have here is the projected revenue loss of $60.5 million given the closure of Indian Point. The blue line at the top is the projected revenue that we negotiated in the 10-year pilot back in 2015. The red line is what we will be receiving as a result of their closure. The gap, $60.5 million. So that's an important number to remember. We heard early on from the state representatives from the governor's office that there is a cessation mitigation program. It's a much longer official term, but it's essentially a pile of money that was approved over the last number of years for communities to apply for, taxing jurisdictions. That includes school districts, that includes villages, counties, you name it, towns. $30 million pot of money for taxing jurisdictions to apply for to offset huge tax spikes. Because when you lose your revenue from a business closing, this money is to soften the blow. And there are some restrictions and there are some questions we have. And some of the questions are right there in red and italics. It's a grant and it's for eligible local communities. So usually grant funds are not guaranteed. Grant funds are sort of set to expire or they're for special projects, so we wanted to learn more about what the state's interpretation of a grant was. We wanted to learn a little bit more about eligibility. Do you have to apply? Do you have paperwork? Do you have to interview? What criteria do you have to meet to be eligible for these funds? The second bullet is the most important. Tax loss must be 20% or more. We'll talk about that in a second. And the last one, awards are over 7 years and you receive up to 80% in the first year and then decreases by 10% each year. So over 7 years, you go from 80% of your gap, year 2 is 70, year 3 is 60, year 3 is 50, all the way down. And the idea is to give you an additional revenue stream while you look at either cutting expenses or you look at increasing taxes. So it's not a shock. Because right now, if we were to completely tax our way out of $60.5 million over 4 years, it's an average tax increase of 13% per year each year. So it's 13% on average, then another 13, another, and another. All right, so that's an increase of 56% over 4 years. All right, we know that there are not many communities, if any, that would support that.
Joe, is this federal given? Is this federal
State
or state money given to?
State money, and right now there are 5 communities who are eligible for this fund and are receiving money. All right, so it's already up and running, and there are already 5 communities throughout the state who are using it. So we had some questions. Yeah,
All right, one quick question. So if we tax 13% each year over those years, is there any other funding revenue source that we would lose because we're going over a certain cap?
We're not going over the cap. The cap, because we're losing all that pilot money, your cap goes up as your pilot money goes down at the same proportion. So it doesn't mean much because we still have to pass for 50%, but we don't have to go to supermajority. So the first year we lose 7 million. Our cap is whatever 2% plus that 7 million. That's why if you look in the past, our tax caps were very low because we were getting all the extra money from the pilot, and that went against the cap. So now it will go in our favor, but still 50%.
But we would still need a majority.
And by the way, so you can understand, this 13% won't be the total increase. That will be just to make up the pilot. You know that we don't live in a zero budget increase, so we need to add that.
So if our expenses go up 1.5% a year because of obligations, gas goes up, oil, whatever, 13 would be on top of that 1.5. So as we researched this cessation mitigation program fund, we had these questions, and these questions were formulated in a meeting we hosted with Assemblywoman Galiff, with State Senator Terrence Murphy, Linda Puglisi, the town supervisor, and Teresa Knickerbocker, the Village of Buchanan mayor. So these were the questions we had to quiz the state on. We needed to know whether or not this funding was guaranteed. We needed to know if other communities could become eligible for this fund. That sure, it's going to grow to 45 million in the year 2020, but who else is out there pulling from it? Because you could increase the amount of money available or that you could apply for, but if demand increases, your share of the pie could actually decrease. So we wanted to learn about that. Most importantly, the middle bullet, is this a law or annual budget appropriation? Meaning every year, does the Senate, Assembly, and the governor need to sign off on this, or did they enact it one year and it lives in future years? Because that's important. 7 years of funding is nice, but eventually you get down to zero, and 7 years does go by quickly. And most importantly, we're not eligible in the first year because our first year tax loss is less than 20%. That's right there. If we had the ability to zoom in, I would tell you that in the last year of being fully funded in the pilot, $24.89 million, in year one of the closure plan, we go down from 28.9 to 21.75. That's not a 20% hit.
Is there anything we could do?
We'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
So this was perhaps the most important conversation we had. Was it's great that the state has 45 million in an account, but we're not even eligible in year one. We would be eligible in year two when we go from 24.8 million to 14.4. So we have to live through a $10 million revenue hit in order to be eligible for the state funding. So we did our research, and last Thursday we invited representatives from the state to our local task force meeting. And I give them credit for being honest, but they certainly delivered a tough message. This fund, the cessation fund, is an annual appropriation. It's annually subject to budget approval. So it does not live forever because the legislature cannot essentially handcuff future legislations with this funding. So it's an annual appropriation. It's a competitive application, meaning just because you're eligible doesn't mean you'll get it. There's some bureaucracy and paperwork we would have to do, or go through, but the state assured us that we would be provided technical assistance and that we wouldn't lose out because we didn't dot an I or cross a T. We also learned that this is statewide funding, that this is for every community in New York State that has a power plant close. And right now there are 5 communities or 5 taxing jurisdictions that are pulling on the 30 million to the tune of 8 million. So The way this program was presented to us back last May was there's $30 million, and in the year 2020 it grows by $15 million to $45 million. And that made us feel very, very good that, okay, there's some financial help. The reality is that's a $30 million program. It's not an annual new $30 million, sort of like our budgets were. You know, every July 1st we replenish our budget codes, and we have resources to make purchases. This is a $30 million program where in 2020, $15 million will be added to it. So we took issue with how the state was marketing this plan, because they said 30 million is eligible, or 30 million is available, and it will grow to 45 million. It will never reach 45 million, because those 5 communities are already pulling $8 million out of the $30 million funding pot. So that's 22 million, and if it just stays static in the year 2020, that 22 will become 37, but it can never ever become 45. Not without an entire new cessation plan, without it approved by the Senate, the Assembly, and the government. So we know it works because there are 5 communities pulling funds from it. And lastly, what we learned is under the current funding model, the mitigation fund will zero out. It'll be out of money in the year 2023. So even if we can receive special legislation to be eligible in year 1, we get 80%, year 2, 70, year 3, 60. There's no year 4, because that would be the year 2024. So we very professionally had disagreements with the state last Thursday, and we discussed different policy recommendations or advocacy recommendations, and they're all aimed to mitigate tax hikes. So Senator Murphy is already working on the financials of what an Indian Point specific mitigation fund would look like. What sort of funding would our entire community need to receive in order to remain whole, at least during the additional 5 years that the pilot was supposed to expire in 2025. We also are looking at Assemblywoman Galiff and Senator Murphy looking at upping that pot of money in the cessation fund to make sure there's enough money there to fund all of our communities for the entire 7 years when we become eligible in 2020. What that would mean is legislation. They would propose legislation to increase the revenue toward the cessation fund and probably some other legal mumbo jumbo, but that's something they've committed to. We want to petition the state to lower the eligibility for year 1 from 20% to 15%. That would make us eligible if the first 2 bullets were not able to be achieved. The third one, or fourth one, is earmark special funding for Indian Point communities. This would be essentially, it used to be called bullet aid, where legislators could write special legislation for their communities that have financial need. We're not sure how this would work because we would need senators and state assembly folks from the Adirondacks and Buffalo to approve $60 or more million to our community, and I'm sure they would say, okay, what are you going to do for me? Mm-hmm. So there may be some technical issues with how that gets done. It doesn't mean it won't be proposed. It's just whether or not that's the right avenue to go. What we're currently working on with the state is fast-tracking the sale of Indian Point property for purposes of redevelopment. The property is 240 acres. The plant and the footprint for decommissioning will not require all 240 acres. So the state has footed the bill for an economic developer to work with Entergy and Indian Point to see if parts of that 240 acres, for lack of a better term, could be roped off and sold, and see if there's potential redevelopment. Not too sure how many businesses would want to open up or build or buy property near what will become a nuclear waste field, but hopefully not. But it's riverfront property, and it's the only significant stretch of riverfront property from New York City to Albany on the east side of the river that doesn't have a train track. So there are some selling points. And the reason we're supporting redevelopment is because that property becomes taxable again. So if you sell it and you build something, that property has value, and we would receive taxes from it, which would offset tax base. And lastly, Congressman Nita Lowey's proposals, which were made public yesterday. So she has 3 policy proposals that are being drafted, and all of them would generate some revenue to all of the taxing jurisdictions. The first one is removing nuclear waste. Essentially what she's asking for is expediting the removal of the spent nuclear rods. Dry casks are
Fuel
the
rods.
storage units that they go in. And she's essentially suggesting if you're going to close Indian Point because it's a nuclear power plant and it's not safe, it's going to be as equally unsafe with spent nuclear fuel rods there, whether you're making energy with it or not.
Those are more dangerous.
Yeah, you've got nukes on your property. They're just as dangerous, even if you're not making energy. So she's trying to use the same argument that led to the closure. She's trying to use the same argument to maybe expedite the removal of the nuclear fuel rods. And if we can do that, that makes the flip of that property much more doable in a much more shorter period of time.
It's going to be very typical.
The Safe and Secure Decommissioning Act, same thing. She's essentially saying let's move those spent fuel rods and make sure that the federal government, the NRC, is responsible for all of the security. And the last one is the Redistribution of Fines to Our Community Act. And this essentially is a revenue maker. Right now, the NRC collects fines when nuclear plants violate whatever rules, laws, or regulations. What she's proposing is that any fines that are collected go back to the school district, the town, and the village, and not go sit in a bank account in Washington, D.C., where we're not really sure where those fines go. It's sort of like you get a speeding ticket. Where does that money really go? Does the $100 you pay for a speeding ticket get redistributed? Does it go to the town or village bottom line? Everyone sort of wonders what are we paying for? What she's suggesting here is any fines go back to the communities in terms of revenue. And then she's co-sponsoring the Stranded Act, which essentially says communities can bill the federal government for storing nuclear waste. Because when a nuclear power plant shuts down and ceases to operate, the federal government is essentially the landlord. And what she's suggesting is the federal government's going to sit on property for 60 years, which is about the length of time to decommission a nuclear power plant. The federal government should be paying someone something for sitting on that property, really tying it up. So hopefully these get some traction. I think they might, because right now the power in Washington lies with Republicans, and more often than not, Republicans support nuclear power, and this is a way, for them to support nuclear power without keeping the plant going. I mean, that's just a guess. Who really knows how things happen in Washington these days? But she has put that out there and is standing by those proposals, and all 4 of them, including the Stranded Act, can support us. We have been putting out all of our Indian Point information all over the place, website, Facebook, Twitter. We have YouTube videos. We've done podcasts. You heard earlier, I've been out to the PTAs, and really excited about the work of Power Through Cortland. This group, non-for-profit, was born really out of a group of parents that wanted to echo the work we were doing, but come at it from a more community-minded standpoint, because we get paid to pound our fist and demand better, but the governor has shown and has acquiesced on a number of education-related policies when PTAs and parents got involved. So they have done postcard writing campaigns. They have been to the Capitol. They have met with our lawmakers. So they're certainly championing our message. So any questions on Indian Point and next steps?
I just, I think about the fact that Indian Point is providing so much energy to not just our area, but, a large amount of people. Has there been...
No, right?
There
You know
will
the answer?
be...
She knows what the question is.
Could you repeat the question?
Has there been...
No plan.
That's the question.
To replace the power.
No plan to
Has there
replace the
been any surveys conducted to make sure that there is something in place to
Power?
make sure
Replacement
that,
power?
right?
Bill,
the
she's
power,
cute too, honey.
Is there any talk of any
Yes.
other company perhaps
Yes.
coming in and being able to take
that I
this
don't.
over?
What I can tell you is part of the closure process, when any power plant closes, they have to do a study for replacement power. And it's this group called the ISO, Independent System Operator. Nonpartisan, they're not on anyone's team. They do a complete survey of the power that's coming off the grid and determine if there's enough power within a certain radius to make up for that within a certain window, so that the ratepayers don't see a demand, increased demand on the grid, so our rates don't go up, and also to make sure there's enough power that there are no brownouts or blackouts. So the ISO will be conducting their study, and I believe it will either be done in December or early in 2018. And one way for Indian Point to stay open is if the ISO, if their study says there's not enough replacement power within this closure window, they can recommend that Indian Point stay open. They can't make them stay open, they recommend it. So they go to Indian Point and they say, we need your power because the replacement, the plans for replacement power aren't up and ready, they're not sufficient enough, they don't meet the threshold, that I just shared. And then they negotiate with Indian Point a price to keep Indian Point open. So the federal government cuts a deal with Indian Point to keep producing power in the absence of replacement power.
The federal or state government?
What's that?
Federal or state?
The feds.
The federal.
The
So the
feds.
ISO is a federal.
The ISO is a federal agent, part of.
But
the
then
department.
the Fed pays for that, or the feds? Or
Yeah,
the
they
state?
they essentially have an account that they negotiate. They negotiate with Indian Point to stay open to produce power until replacement energy can be identified. And right now there are two projects that are proposed, but there has not been a shovel in the ground. One of them is wind farms off of Montauk and the Hamptons,
Right.
and the second.
That's going to be lovely.
And the second is essentially, for lack of a better term, an extension cord that runs from Quebec or Montreal all the way under the Hudson River, 333 miles. And there are a lot of hoops to jump through. There's a lot of permits that need to be awarded. There's a whole lot of work that needs to be done. So people aren't necessarily convinced that that replacement power will be ready. Now, there's a gas-fired plant called Cricket Valley, somewhere around here, that could be up and running. There has been rumored discussion that a company would come in and sort of flip Indian Point to a gas-powered plant, which could produce energy. It's a little dirtier, but it produces energy, and they would pay taxes. So there's still hope, but it's not a guarantee. And in the closure agreement, Indian Point has to remain eligible to be open for 2 years, 2 different sessions. So a 2-year period of time, and then the ISO does another study, and if there isn't replacement power, Indian Point can stay open 2 more. But so a maximum of 4, but in 2-year increments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions
There
or
was,
comments?
at the task force meeting, I understand that Linda Lacey had talked about negotiating a new pilot with Indian
So,
Point.
so what happened way long ago when we were trying to figure out how much is the Indian Point property worth when they were producing electricity. And that's really hard to figure out what the value of that property is. And so what all of our taxing jurisdictions did, we did a pilot, payment in lieu of taxes. What that created was a guaranteed revenue stream. It was a guaranteed expense stream for Entergy, Con Ed and then Entergy. And everyone sort of agreed the guaranteed and viable revenue stream is more important than some assessor or a bunch of lawyers fighting in court about the value of the property. Next, the proceeding is called a tax certiorari. That's where you essentially fight your tax assessment, and it goes to court, and you just spend a lot of money and not getting a great outcome. So when Indian Point closes and they're no longer producing power, Indian Point would say the value of this property is nothing because it's going to take 60 years to decommission. We're not making a profit, so the property's not producing any revenue stream. It could be worth $1 because you can't touch it. What we would say is, oh no, it's worth a lot of money, 240 acres right on the river, blah, 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 and we all would fight in court about it. And we would have to try to find some other nuclear power plant that's decommissioned, like Indian Point, another part of the country, and it's almost impossible. So what we would entertain would be a post-operation pilot, which would create another guaranteed revenue stream while they're no longer producing power. That would be another negotiation like we just went through a couple years ago. We would have our consultants, they would have theirs, and we would try to meet in the middle, but the goal would be guaranteed revenue so we can make multi-year budget projections.
Anybody else? I would just like to thank you for all of the time and effort that you have put into working on this and, helping us. And
Sadly.
well, I just
we're all
think
specialists in nuclear power.
you've gone to the schools. I know you and I and Beth Gruber went out and spoke to the senior citizens, and we will continue to go out, I'm sure, and speak to a variety of groups. You have to do this.
And that's a really good segue because tomorrow we are going to debut a community survey. And the community survey is twofold. One, to identify what people know and the extent that they're aware of Indian Point, so we can better direct any communications around that, or to educate our community on what they need to know and baseline information. And also to revisit some questions we had and interests we had around our facilities. So I don't know how to blow this up, but I won't. But essentially it's a welcome to our community survey. We're interested in your feedback. We want to hear about your perceptions of Indian Point Communications as well as our facilities. And I won't walk through all the questions, but in our previous surveys that David White did for us, former board member, we want to create some standard data sets so we can gauge responses over time and who's weighing in. So it's a simple SurveyMonkey tool, but there's a theme and a flow to the questions so we can have some longitudinal data. So we want to know where you live. We want to know if you have kids. We want to know how are you getting your news about Indian Point, so we can direct our communications that way. Let me fast forward to get to some. Here's stuff about Indian Point. How familiar are you with the timeline for them closing? This will help us direct some communication so we can get people up to speed. Barbara mentioned when we went to the senior center, they all were very astutely aware of Indian Point because most, if not all, of these folks are on fixed incomes.
They're
trying to figure out what to do. We get here to district infrastructure. So we're asking about their opinions of our facilities. Classrooms, exterior, we call these public spaces, foyers, gyms.
So we're going from, we're losing a ton of money, but how do you feel about it?
Yeah, how do you feel about it? Level of security, and then this one is really the most important one.
Yeah.
Last year we did a survey. Feedback indicated they would support a bond that did not increase taxes. The reality is, whatever happens with Indian Point, the cessation fund, litigation, we have aging facilities. Kids need to be in safe schools and classrooms with 21st century technology. We can't can't quit on the opportunities we provide our kids while we figure out Indian Point. The timing, again, just like we stood here a year ago, almost a year to the day, talking about the debt we have retiring, the opportunity to reissue that debt, that would not create a new tax. Right, Bill?
Don't.
Right.
Smile.
It wouldn't be an additional one. Now,
Right.
what Bill will say is that we have an option with retiring debt would be to lower the tax levy. He'd be absolutely right. And the committee talked about that last year and said, yeah, but is the value of lowering the tax levy per resident worth the opportunity cost of not doing a project for, basic upgrades to the school? And if you remember last year, we received very positive feedback about some of those basic upgrades. Doors, windows, technology, upgrading our science classrooms, our auditoriums, those sort of spaces. So be very anxious to see what we get back, to see if there's trend data, and to see if the Indian Point concern has changed people's opinions. The survey is live, but we haven't told anyone until tonight. So a big district email will go out to everyone tomorrow. We're also doing postcards because the majority of our residents, we have no way of communicating with them digitally, so we'll send them a postcard, and the survey's open until the 7th. So a good, solid 2-week chunk of time.
I also want to remind you to also have some hard copies of the survey that we can maybe distribute in the library and to the senior citizen facilities and any other places that you think would be beneficial, because not everybody has a computer.
Post office.
Yeah.
Their
Businesses even.
And this is not it's not a perfect instrument. And if David White was here, he would tell you that, because you can have people that, click on it from anywhere and take it 10 times. But over the last number of years, we've used the same tool. We've asked similar questions, and there is some trend data. So when we get close to closing the survey on the 9th, we have another board meeting on December 13th. We can share some feedback and look at the last number of surveys we've done, I think dating back to 2004 or 6. So we'll have a pretty good handle of the temperature. So that's it. Okay.
Questions, comments?
I have a weird question. God forbid all this goes through, taxes go up with this 13%. Is it proportional? For example, does Buchanan have to pay a ton more taxes than somebody in Croton or something like that?
No,
Because
it's proportional.
it is proportional.
Yeah,
Because
I mean, because your assessed value of your house, today you're paying 1,000 for the sake of it. You're going to have to pay next year 1,107. The person in Buchanan, the assessed value is 100. That person will have to pay 11,700. So the assessed value will be the same, but the rate of the taxes will increase the same for everyone. Not for everyone. Big scale, as always, will be a little bit different, but very simple. So yes, it
Those
will
are just
keep
big
everyone
round numbers
proportional.
for, what is it, every point on the levy rate is a little over 400,000.
Mhm.
So we just use that basic math.
So this is not our new taxes.
No,
one
I
will
know.
benefit, the other one will not. Here,
No,
everyone will
if I
be-
had to guess,
will
what I
be
think
in
Lori is
proportional.
suggesting is that because for all this time, because that
you don't want to
Buchanan
use
has
they've
added-
enjoyed, but
No, but they've had,
much
less,
lower taxes.
would theirs come up to be more in line?
No.
But, the other thing, the flip side of that is other things may change. They may change things like, maybe even the Buchanan government may not be sustainable. So, they
But
may
that
have
doesn't
it
matter.
out.
That doesn't matter for school district.
Correct, I was just saying, but just in the
okay.
town part though.
Yeah,
So
so
there may be
For
changes
us, it
there.
doesn't matter.
So if Teresa McDucker were here, she would say our community is going to take a double hit. School taxes would go up. Let's just say there's no other solution. School taxes would go up, and Village of Buchanan taxes would go up if they don't want to change how they operate. They want to keep their police, they want to keep their garbage, sewer, whatever.
Right.
So she would say there's a double hit because half of their budget is the Entergy pilot. So they have to
Right.
make that up, plus whatever we levy as the school tax.
Both are important, yeah.
Yeah.
But my understanding is that Buchanan residents already got a letter from the town, from the village, asking what they would not like to see go, meaning,
Yeah, they did
What
a
they're willing
survey on their
to,
services.
yeah.
You know, the first
Or
question
not give
was,
up and pay for it.
the first question was, what sort of tax increase could you support? 0 to 25, 26 to 51. I mean, those were the ranges. And then, you know, if we had to eliminate services or absolutely
Like
protect
police.
services,
police, I don't know.
yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, thank you, Joe. As I said, we really appreciate your hard work.